So here's the first one from the far side, who wrote the following, quote, I have a question for Glenn. Oh, you're in the right place. I have a question for Glenn. I saw a post about Patrick Leahy's new memoir where he recounts, and just by the way, Patrick Leahy is a former senator from Vermont, Democratic senator, a long-time senator, just like one of those people who stayed around for 30 years. And he has a new memoir where he recounts that in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, so 2002, 2003, some shadowy figures directing him to request certain top secret intelligence documents showed that Bush and Cheney were lying to the country about the Iraq war. He acknowledges that he was therefore able to get a hold of the information, and that although perhaps as a result he was one of the few senators to vote against the war for reasons unknown, he kept the information to himself, rather than, for example, disclosing it on the Senate floor where he would have had immunity for doing so. That strikes me as quite an amazing admission. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah, I totally agree with that point of view. And I've seen this happen many times before when senators and Congress members access classified material and they're too scared to show it to the public, even though they could do so on the floor of the Senate or the House, and they enjoy absolute, complete immunity. You cannot be prosecuted or criminalized or arrested for anything you say on the floor of the Congress. It's just written into the Constitution. It's legislative immunity. And they could just go and do it. They could just go and reveal it, but they almost never do. They leave it up to people like Edward Snowden or Julian Assange or other courageous whistleblowers to do it even though they don't have immunity. But these senators do and just conceal this information. So here's what he wrote in his memoir, The Road Taken by Patrick Leahy. And by the way, the date it's not a new memoir. It's from 2022. It's just a couple of years ago, but it just got resurfaced and started viralizing on X. I think a lot of people didn't know about it who would sit down and read Pat Leahy's book. I certainly didn't. But here's part of what he wrote in telling this story. Quote, my conclusion was caution. I simply did, when talking about the run up to the war in Iraq, I simply didn't see proof of an imminent threat or a new rush by a madman to obtain weapons of mass destruction. I saw the status quo as it had been for a long time. Quote, looks like the Middle East, I said to the intelligence officer sitting at the desk. The following Sunday, my wife Marcelle and I went for our usual early morning walk in the neighborhood. It was a warm September day, and we walked hand in hand. Two fit joggers trailed behind us. They stopped and asked what I thought of the intelligence briefings I'd been getting. Marcelle, his wife, realized this was a conversation that normally she would not have been involved in and kept on walking ahead. I went through a requisite disclaimer that if I was in a briefing and if they were classified, I could not acknowledge that even occurred and could not talk about them if they had. They told me they understood that, but asked me whether the briefers had showed me file 8. So imagine you're just walking on the street with your wife. It's like an old couple walking on the street. And out of nowhere, there's like very fit joggers behind you. And they are obviously following you, and they stop and they say, hey, we hear you're being in briefings. How have those been going? And you say, fine, but I can't talk about them. They're like, no worries. We don't want you to talk about them. Just take a look at file 8. Have you seen that? And he writes, quote, it was obvious from the look on my face that I had not seen such a file. They suggested I should and that I might find it interesting. Quickly thereafter, so that's it. They were like, hey, go see file 8. Quickly thereafter, I arranged to see file 8, and it contradicted much of what I had heard from the Bush administration. Days later, my wife Marcelle and I were out walking again when the two joggers reappeared. After the opening greetings, they told me they understood I had seen file 8 and asked me what did I think about it. It was the eeriest conversation I'd experienced in Washington. I felt like a senatorial version of Bob Woodward meeting Deep Throat, only in broad daylight. I went through the usual disclaimers that I could not talk about any file and if such a file was available and so on. They said, of course they understood. But they wondered if I had also been shown file 12 using a code word. They're like, hey, remember when we mentioned file 8? We're glad you took a look at that. No, don't worry. We don't need to hear your opinion. We just want to know, you should look at file 12 too. He says, quote, again, I think the look on my face gave them the answer. They apologized for interrupting our walk and jogged off. The next day I was back in the secure room in the Capitol to read file 12. And it again contradicted the statements that the administration, and especially Vice President Cheney, seemed to be relying on. And I told my staff and others that for a number of reasons, I absolutely intended to vote against the war in Iraq. Now, according to Pat Leahy, he had been directed to by mysterious deep state operatives, obviously, 2 files, classified files that he had not been shown by the people briefing Congress on the Iraq War, both of which he says proved that the government was lying to the American people. Now, I would think that somebody in that position would be like, hey, I need to show the American people this. I need to alert the American people to the fact that there are documents inside the government's own file that prove that what Dick Cheney and George Bush are saying about the war in Iraq are lying. I should let the American people know that they're being deceived and tricked yet again into supporting a war. But no, he didn't do that. He was like, yeah, I let people know around me. I'm going to vote against it. Yeah, great job, Senator Leahy. The vote was 77-23 in favor of the Iraq War. Congratulations on your super consequential no vote. Who knows what would have happened had he come forward the way any minimally courageous or ethical person would have. And again, he had legal immunity to do it. He could have read the whole file on the Senate floor and nothing would have happened. Even if he didn't have immunity, I would think you would be duty bound when the government is selling a war to the population, a very serious invasion on the other side of the world, not a few bombs being dropped. And you have proof that what the government is saying is lying, but that's not what Pat Leahy did. And he even admitted that in his book, not even realizing there's anything wrong with it. There's a woman on X who I find to be genuinely one of the smartest and most interesting X accounts to follow. Her X name is Village Crazy Lady, but her name is Mel, and she is very upfront. She does a podcast. She's a MAGA woman, self-identified MAGA woman from the South, and yet she really actually believes in MAGA principles. She is vehemently opposed to all kinds of intervention. She's opposed to funding the war in Ukraine, funding Israel's war in Gaza, going to war with Iran, bombing Yemen, all the things that we were promised that Trump would do in foreign policy. She actually believes in it and insists on it and complains when it doesn't happen, as she should. And she's just very smart. She's just always plugged into what I think are the right things, thinking about things in a really interesting way. I actually learned a lot from following her. I'm going to have her on the show soon. And she was the one who alerted me to this, and I think she was probably the one who alerted a lot of people to this. She said, quote, "I think about this thread all the time. A sitting U.S. senator admitting that days before Congress voted to invade Iraq, he was contacted by 2 shadowy figures jogging in the park who directed him to view the contents of, quote, File 8 in the intelligence briefing prepared for Congress. The next day, Leahy goes to the SCIF, which is the room for classified information in Washington, and pulls File 8, and lo and behold, it contains information directly disputing public statements made by the Bush administration about Iraq's WMDs. A few days later, Leahy is in the same park, and the same joggers come up to him and tell him to request a viewing of, quote, File 12. Leahy goes back to the SCIF and again views intel that directly contradicts public statements being made by Dick Cheney at the time. The info convinces Leahy to vote against the invasion, but we all know it doesn't matter. The final Senate vote was 77 yeas to 23 nays. Just imagine if Leahy or any of the other senators who presumably saw the same thing cared more about the country and the Constitution than they did about respecting the rules of classified documents. Imagine if they had gone public with what they saw, evidence that Bush and Cheney were lying to the American people. They could have prevented the whole catastrophe that was the Iraq War. Once again, we hear the war drums in the distance. This time it's Iran. Let's pray that if we get to that point again, there will be at least one American senator who will have the courage to do what Leahy did not. I think what's really notable, too, is imagine that you're those 2 guys who obviously are risking your career, probably risking your liberty, to try to make sure that Pat Leahy sees not just circumstantial evidence, but proof that the Bush and Cheney administration are lying about the key arguments they're trying to sell to the public to justify the invasion of Iraq. And they put themselves on the line. They put themselves at risk because they apparently thought it was important for the truth to be known. And they get Leahy to go read both of those files, and he just does nothing to tell the public. He's just like, yeah, I'm going to vote no. He didn't even tell his fellow senators. He didn't say a word. How pathetic is that? How cowardly is that? You know, like you run for the Senate, you're a career politician, you're like old, you're in like your 23rd term or whatever, who cares? Like don't you have any sense of like duty at all? Like, I don't want to be naive. I get that these are scummy politicians, very conniving. The more they stay around Washington, probably the less principled, the fewer principles they believe they can operate on, the more kind of just pragmatic and cunning or whatever they become. But you're talking here about the most serious war that the United States has fought since at least Vietnam. And you have the evidence in your hands that the government is lying yet again, like they did with the Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin. And you just sit and say nothing? Now, I've seen this many times before, and I'm going to get to that, but there's a counterexample. When Daniel Ellsberg discovered the Pentagon Papers in the 1960s, the late 1960s, and the Pentagon Papers were a multi-volume, tens of thousands of pages account compiled by the Pentagon and the Rand Corporation to give policymakers in the Pentagon and the White House a true picture of the war in Vietnam. And the Pentagon Papers concluded, and members of the highest levels of the government also knew, under Lyndon Johnson and then Richard Nixon, that there was no way the U.S. could win the war in Vietnam. At most, they could fight to a standstill. And yet they were constantly telling the public that was growing tired of this war, like, hey, we're losing all our young people, our young men who are being drafted. We're killing huge numbers of people. We're spending tons of money. There's social unrest. Like, what is going on? So the Pentagon would say, oh, don't worry. We're close to winning. We're like 6 months away from winning. We're making immense progress. Inside, though, in the Pentagon Papers, they were saying the exact opposite. They knew they couldn't win. So it's the same thing. Daniel Ellsberg had proof in his hands that the American government was lying to the people about the Vietnam War. And Ellsberg had a very high position in the government. He had a PhD from Harvard in nuclear policy. He worked at the highest levels of the Rand Corporation, had some of the most, the access to the most sensitive documents inside the government. And he did what Patrick Leahy wouldn't do, which is he's like, I got to get this to the public, even though I'm probably going to go to jail for life. He wasn't a senator. He didn't have any sort of parliamentary immunity. And he tried to get members of Congress to read it on the floor. And when he couldn't, he went to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and they published parts of it. But then finally he found Senator Mike Gravel, a Republican from Alaska, who was like, no, you know what? I have parliamentary immunity, and this is what it's for. The public has a right to know that the American people are lying to the public. Now, by the way, Daniel Ellsberg was charged with espionage. They tried to imprison him for life. And the only reason why his case was dismissed was because the Nixon administration was discovered to have burglarized the office of his psychoanalyst to try and find dirt on the private life of Daniel Ellsberg. And the judge, because of that misconduct, dismissed the case. But had the judge not done so, Daniel Ellsberg probably would have been in prison for the rest of his life. He just died about 18 months ago at the age of 94. I had the honor of working with him when we created the Freedom of the Press Foundation together. He was unbelievably smart, like one of the smartest people I ever met. And even at like 91 or 92, he would attend these board meetings we had at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He would just present like the most complex arguments possible. So he got Senator Gravel to read it from the floor of the Senate. And this is what that kind of bravery looks like.
Mr. President, Mr. Congressman, the people must know the full story of what has occurred over the past 20 years within their government. The story is a terrible one. It is replete with duplicity, connivance against the public and public officials. I know of nothing in our history to equal it for extent of failure and extent of loss in all aspects of the term. We can people, human beings, are being killed as I speak to you tonight, killed as a direct result of policy decisions we as a body have made. Arms are being severed. Metal is crashing through human bodies because of a public policy. This government One may respond that we made such a sacrifice to preserve freedom and liberty in Southeast Asia. One may respond that we sacrifice ourselves on the continent of Asia so that we will not have to fight a similar war on the shores of America. One can make these arguments only if he has failed to read the Pentagon Papers.
So that was the prelude to him then reading the Pentagon Papers into the record. And you can be uncomfortable with or even mock, if you want, the very emotional display of Senator Gravel there. He was crying in the middle of that statement. But I would suggest that that is a far more admirable and noble and understandable reaction than what Senator Leahy did. I mean, every day, if you're a senator in the late 1960s, early 1970s, you're getting intelligence briefings on how unbelievably horrific the Vietnam War is. 58,000 Americans killed, 2 million Vietnamese at least killed. I mean, just the use of biological agents like Agent Orange. It was a brutal, savage, barbaric war. And the people who were in there in the middle of the jungles and rivers of Vietnam had no idea why they were fighting there, why they were being killed on the other side of the world. And so if you're aware of information that the public can perhaps use to understand they're being lied to and hopefully stop the war, I think it's absolutely commendable to think about what's happening to human beings. I mean, that's a humanistic response. But he didn't just cry about it. He actually tried to do something about it. I mean, even though they have parliamentary immunity, reading top secret Pentagon documents about a war in the middle of Washington, D.C., you would never know for certain that that's going to be honored. In fact, here in Brazil, there's a very similar parliamentary immunity privilege that people in Congress and the Senate enjoy. And a couple months ago, a member of Congress went to the microphone, speak of the tribunal, where he heavily criticized the authoritarian chief judge of the Supreme Court, even though he's not technically the chief judge. He's in fact acts that way, Alexandre de Moraes. And then shortly after, Alexandre de Moraes ordered the police to investigate him and to try and convict him for having spoken there. And their argument was, yeah, they have parliamentary immunity, but it's not absolute. You can have it as long as you don't criticize this authoritarian judge. So I wouldn't be 100% sure at all that if I read top secret military documents in the middle of a war, it can be considered treason. But Mike Gravel went and did it anyway. That's what courage is. In contrast to Pat Leahy. And there's another case that I'm very familiar with, that I've had personal dealings with, that to this day sickens me, that I just want to tell you about. So, for about 2 or 3 years before the Snowden reporting started, before Edward Snowden risked his liberty to come forward and show his fellow citizens the truth about how the government was spying on them with no limits and no warrants, and risking his life in prison to do it, and he didn't go to prison, but that's only because he's in exile and asylum in Russia for the last 12 years with no end in sight. So he paid a price, but it was a courageous thing to do. But two different senators, Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, Ron Wyden of Oregon, Mark Udall of Utah, went around like hinting that, oh, the NSA is doing some really bad stuff that the American public, if they knew about, would be angered by, would be enraged by. But they never said what it was. They could have done what Senator Gravel did and gone to the floor, but no, they just kept like hinting. They would write emails, like they would do in interviews, they would go write op-eds saying, oh, if you only knew how they were interpreting the Patriot Act and what they were allowing the NSA to do, you would be enraged. But they didn't have the courage to say it. And it was only once Snowden came forward and we started publishing reporting about what the NSA was doing based on his courageous act, did they start coming forward and say things like this from the Washington Post, July 28, 2013. The headline in the Post, with NSA revelations, meaning the Snowden reporting, Senator Ron Wyden's vague privacy warnings finally become clear. Exactly, he was dropping little hints. And he could have just said it on the Senate floor with immunity, but he waited for Snowden to come forward and do it even though he had no immunity. Think about how cowardly that is. Here's Wyden in 2011. May of 2011, so basically 2 years before we started the Snowden reporting, on the Senate floor, dropping his little hints.
You go into the Intelligence Committee several times a week, as Senator Udall and I do. You come away with the indisputable judgment that there are threats to the well-being of this country, that there are people who do not wish our citizens well. So in these dangerous times, the sources and methods of our anti-terror operations absolutely must be kept secret. That is fundamental to the work of the intelligence community. Keeping the sources and methods of those who serve us so gallantly secret and ensure that they are as safe as possible. But while we protect those sources and methods, the laws that authorize them should not be kept secret from the American people. Yes, we need secret operations, but secret law is bad for our democracy. It will undermine the confidence that the American people have in our intelligence operations.
God, that is so inspiring. You have no idea how much that makes me well up with pride at our leaders. He's like, secret laws, meaning like the way they interpreted the Patriot Act to allow the NSA to spy on all Americans without warrants. Like, secret laws are dangerous. We can't have these. We have secret laws. And you know who knew what those secret laws were? Ron Wyden. He's like, it's so dangerous to have secret laws. Then why didn't you disclose what was being done? He's saying like sources and methods have to be protected. Like you don't disclose the names of people in foreign countries who collaborate with the United States government because that could get them killed. Fine. And methods, okay, you don't disclose the blueprints of like the technology used to surveil because then other countries might copy them or learn how to evade them. Fine. But he's saying what you can't have is secret law where the government is spying on American citizens based on radical interpretations of the law because that's very dangerous. But you know who helped keep those secret laws a secret? Ron Wyden, because he was too afraid to do what Mike Gravel did. He was like Pat Leahy. He was in possession of extremely relevant, important information that the U.S. government, that the American people had the right to have, but he was too afraid, even though he's speaking on the Senate floor right there with immunity, to actually say what it is. March 15, 2012, about 9 months before Snowden first contacted me, about a year before we went to Hong Kong to meet with him, both Senator Wyden and Senator Udall wrote a joint letter to then Attorney General Eric Holder. And you see there, it's on the U.S. Senate letterhead, very, very official, very elegant, very historic calligraphy. And they said, quote, "We have discussed the dangers of relying on secret interpretations of public law with you on multiple occasions, but through correspondence and both through correspondence and in person. While we know that you are generally aware of our views on the subject, we feel obliged to comment specifically on the Justice Department's recent attempt to seek dismissal of 2 lawsuits that have been filed under the Freedom of Information Act and that specifically pertain to this problem of secret law. We believe most Americans would be stunned to learn." We believe most Americans would be stunned to learn, stunned. They would be stunned if they knew the details of how these secret court opinions have interpreted Section 215 of the Patriot Act. As we see it, there is now a significant gap between what most Americans believe the law allows and what the government secretly claims the law allows. This is a problem because it is impossible to have an informed public debate about what the law should say and what the public doesn't know what its government thinks the law says. Do you see this posturing, this cowardly, disgusting posturing? The people have the right to know what our government is doing when interpreting the Patriot Act and what they're arguing it allows them to do when spying on American citizens, but they never have the courage, despite how dangerous they said it was, despite how toxic to democracy they said it was, despite how it robs people of the right of consent in a democracy. Americans never learned about this and never would have had it not been for the fact that Edward Snowden, seeing that senators were too scared to reveal it, seeing that when James Clapper, the senior intelligence official, the director of national intelligence for Obama, went before the Senate and Ron Wyden asked him, trying to get Clapper to have to admit it, "Are you collecting huge dossiers on American citizens?" And seeing that James Clapper lied and said, "No, sir, not wittingly." And Ron Wyden didn't say anything, didn't say, "You're lying." And Snowden had the proof in his hand that he was lying. It was like, if I don't come forward, no one's going to know. And he came forward knowing he'd probably go to prison for life. And that's what led to this article, which was the first one we published from the Snowden file on June 6, 2013. The headline, which says, "NSA collecting phone records of millions of Verizon customers. Exclusive top secret court order requiring Verizon to hand over all call data shows the scale of domestic surveillance under Obama." And for those who don't recall, that was a court order issued in secret by a secret FISA court, ordering all telephone carriers, we had the Verizon one, but it was all telephone carriers, to just turn over to the government en masse all the call records of every American citizen, who you call, where you were when you called, how long the call was, and who you called. You can put together a massive dossier of someone's life by knowing that information. That's what the secret law, the secret court, claimed the Patriot Act allowed. Now, get this. On the day that we published the first article, June 6, Mark Udall went to the Washington Post and said, look at this headline, "Mark Udall, I tried to expose this NSA program." What was stopping him? It was Snowden came forward, he's like, "Yeah, that was what I meant, that I tried to expose it too." What did you do to expose it? You were too afraid to do anything. Quote, Senator Mark Udall, Democrat of Colorado, that's right, I said Utah earlier, it's Colorado, said he, quote, "did everything short of leaking classified information to bring attention to the NSA's seizure of American phone records." Quote, "I did everything in my power to bring attention to the program," he told the Denver Post. He had it in his power to do what Snowden did, to do what we reported. He was too much of a coward to do it. Here's Mark Udall, also in 2011, posturing as being so enraged and indignant about what the government was doing in secret, how they were interpreting the Patriot Act to go way beyond what even the author of the Patriot Act said anyone imagined it would be used for. And he too dropped these little crumbs, these little hints, like you're kind of playing like charades. You give like little hints, but you're not allowed to say the answer because you get disqualified. You just kind of try and provoke someone to figure it out. Little like puzzle pieces. Listen to this.
Terrorism tools to achieve these important goals. And indeed, many of the Patriot Act's provisions, which I support, have made our nation safer since those devastating attacks on that day we'll always remember on 9/11. We know that for a fact. But the problem we confront today is that there are three provisions that we're debating that fail to strike the right balance between keeping us safe while protecting the privacy rights of Coloradans and all Americans. Instead, these three provisions are far too susceptible to abuse by the federal government, even in the name of keeping us safe from terrorism. I don't say this lightly, but my concerns about some of these provisions have only grown since I've been briefed on their interpretation and their implementation as a member of the Intelligence Committee. Let me share some examples. Currently, the intelligence community can place wide-ranging wiretaps on Americans without even identifying the target or the location of such surveillance. That's one concern. A second concern, the intelligence community can target individuals who have no connection to terrorist organizations. And a third concern that I have is they can collect business records on law-abiding Americans who have no connection to terrorism. We ought to be able to at least agree that the source of an investigation under the Patriot Act should have a terrorist-related focus. If we can't limit investigations to terrorism, my concern is, where do they end? Is there no amount of information that our government can collect that should be off limits? I know Coloradans are demanding that we at least place common sense limits on government investigations and link data collection to terrorist-related activities. If we pass this bill, Mr. President, to extend the Patriot Act till 2015, it would mean that for 4 more years, the federal government will continue to have unrestrained access to private information about Americans who have no connection to terrorism, with little to no accountability as to how these powers are used.
I mean, you know what? I reported on this topic for 3 years. It was a very important part of my career. I still pay very close attention to the surveillance debate. I could barely get through that. It was so ambiguous, so bereft of anything substantive that you could really understand what the government was doing. Because he too was just a coward. And then the minute we came out with that report, he's like, I tried everything. Yeah, everything except disclosing what you could have disclosed to let the American people know way before Edward Snowden came forward so that he didn't have to spend his life in prison or in Russia. So I think it is very fascinating the way the intelligence community works. They just jog up behind Leahy with his wife. They're like, hey, look at file 8. Bye. And then they come back a few days later, like, hey, we heard you looked at file 8. Great. That's great. Look at file 12. That's very interesting. People in the government, in the intelligence community, were trying to alert the public through Leahy that this proof existed. But he was too much of a coward to do anything about it, and so were Senators Wyden and Udall, where Senator Gravel wasn't. I just want to say the final thing. When Edward Snowden did their jobs for them, when he said, I'm not too afraid to come forward, I'd rather someone in the Senate do it, but they clearly won't. So I guess I have to. And he comes forward and doesn't dump it all on the internet, is as careful as he can be. He gives it to journalists with very conservative instructions about only use this very carefully, don't put anybody in danger, only use it to reveal to the public what they should know. And then he, of course, gets immediately indicted on multiple felony charges, including the Espionage Act that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. They would ask Senator Wyden and Senator Udall, well, he revealed what you said should have been revealed. What do you think of him? Are you defending him? Do you think the prosecution would be dropped? And they'd be like, I'm not really going to talk about Snowden. I mean, he disclosed classified information. You can't have that. Basically, not only unwilling to defend him, but basically calling him a criminal for doing what he did only because they were too afraid to. These people are propellant. They'll let wars happen rather than step forward and confront any sort of risk, or warrantless unconstitutional eavesdropping, as the courts ruled on American citizens with no warrants. And that's the kind of people that, unfortunately, with some exceptions, but very few, get to Washington and sit in both houses of Congress. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.